Hello, everyone. My name is Nina. This is Nicholas. We are translators from Brazil, and we are translating several books from English and Spanish into Portuguese relating to the rejuvenation area. And today we're going to talk with David Wood, who is the writer of the book, The Abolition of Aging, that we are launching now in March of 2020 here in Brazil in a Portuguese version. So, David, can you please present yourself?
Thank you so much for inviting me onto this interview. I have been in my professional life a smartphone technologist. I worked in software for 25 years. For the last 12 years, I have run a group in London called London Futurists, where we have often looked at ideas for how human situation might change quite radically in the not too distant future. In that time, I often had speakers talking about possible wonderful changes in health span, that there may be technological interventions that could effectively lead to the abolition of aging. So a few years ago, I decided to write down these ideas, my own understanding of them, and that led to the book, The Abolition of Aging, which has received lots of very positive feedback.
Well, let me present myself. My name is Nicholas, as Nina told you. And I would like to ask Dave about the beginning of your journey in the rejuvenation area. What made you be interested in the first place in this area? Can you explain a little more of this beginning?
Well, first of all, my background in the high technology field showed me that remarkable changes were possible as a result of technology. I saw that after a long period of disappointment, when smartphones weren't initially successful, then there was a rapid breakthrough, and more people discovered more features of smartphones. And they changed, as a result, many aspects of how they were spending their work, their life, their education, their play, their entertainment. And I realized that similar transformations could be possible in many other fields of life, that we could reprogram not so much our silicon devices, but eventually we could reprogram our own biology. I believe that all people, in fact, have got an innate interest in this possibility. All of us, when we are young, have a moment of shock when we realize that our parents and grandparents and friends and eventually ourselves face the prospect of death. And many of us think in those moments, it would be good if this didn't happen to us. So we have that initial desire to go beyond what nature has given. At the same time, we have another set of ideas in our mind that's wanting to live longer is selfish or immature, and that we need to come to terms with dying. So all of us, I think, have these two personalities in our mind at the same time. And most people suppress the desire to live longer, and they bow to social pressures to look forward to death in some ways, not to accelerate it, but to prepare for it. However, when I encountered people such as Aubrey de Grey and Alex Zavaronkov and many others who spoke about the potential for biological interventions, I thought, actually, this makes a lot of sense. It addresses a deep desire within human life, a deep desire within human nature, and it has plausibility to it. At least it seemed to be plausible. So I decided to research some more. I decided to address two fundamental questions. One, is this set of interventions really possible? And secondly, are they desirable? Because many people actually say, if it were possible to extend lifespan a lot, we shouldn't do it. It would be bad in some ways for humanity, bad for the planet. So these two big questions, can we do it and should we do it, were the starting point for my own research. And I wrote the book, The Abolition of Aging, to try and provide accessible but comprehensive answers to both these two big questions.
One question that I have is that in the book, you present a lot of arguments in favor of the rejuvenation project or the rejuveneering project. What do you consider nowadays? I don't know if your opinion changed in the meantime, but what do you consider to be the strongest argument in favor of the project?
Well, I start off from the point of view that life is good. It's a fundamental human right. Before we can have rights to do other things like vote or work or explore, we need to be alive. And I think that applies for people at all stages of life. I don't think that when people reach a certain age, whether it's 80 or 60 or 100, then suddenly this right stops. The people I've known at these age groups, they're often full of talent, creativity, full of desire. And if they're healthy, they desire to keep on exploring more. So I want to enable this extension of our lives. There's another very big argument, a very practical one, which is that when people become ill, they often cost lots of money to healthcare services. They impose the burden of care on families and friends who have to look after them. And sometimes we say, well, this is inevitable. But I say no. I say if we want to avoid these costs and these burdens, we should remain healthy for as long as possible. What rejuvenation biotechnology offers is the way to not get ill in the first place. The great diseases of cancer, heart disease, dementia, diabetes, and so on, which kill the majority of people, they can all be avoided if we keep the body in a youthful state much longer. And of course, there are some costs to keeping the body in a youthful state. But when you look at the analysis, this will be a much less expensive process than trying to repair people and deal with them when they are already afflicted with many diseases and morbidities. So there's a strong economic argument as well as a strong humanitarian argument as to why the abolition of aging is a good thing to do.
David, we are in 2020, so the book was initially published in 2016. So a very important question is what changed in these 4 years, and how these changes affect the whole rejuvenation project, and how that progress builds on the concepts approached in the book.
So when I wrote the book, I said there was about a 50% chance that there could be rejuvenation technologies widely available at low cost by 2040. I believe we're still on schedule for that. My estimate has not changed because I see many encouraging things having happened in the 4 years in between. For example, I'm seeing larger communities online which are doing very thoughtful experiments and discussions and analysis. And these communities are organizing annual conferences at which very important new pieces of research are published. One important example is the Forever Healthy community, organized by Michael Greve, who is a German entrepreneur. He funds every year the Undoing Aging Conference. It's taken place in Berlin 3 times already, and I believe the 4th one will take place later this year. It's at a larger venue. More scientists are going there, and instead of talking rather embarrassedly about their work, saying, here's some work in gene therapy, and by the way, it might have an implication for aging, now more and more of these scientists are openly saying this research of theirs is significant for extending healthy longevity. So there's a conference every year in Berlin, Undoing Aging. There's another very promising community called Lifespan, sometimes known as LEAF, and they do a conference every year in New York on ending age-related diseases. And that has also gone from strength to strength. So there are more people who are openly saying they are working on this field. I've seen encouraging things in the financial world too. One thing that can make this research go faster is when more people are comfortable in investing the money in research programs that could potentially take a long time. Well, there's a new initiative called Rejuvenescence. It's organized by a multimillionaire in Britain called Jim Mellon. He has a remarkable track record at picking new technologies which are worth investing in. So about a couple of years ago, he identified rejuvenation technologies, rejuvenation biotechnologies, as a field that would now be significant for investing. And what he does with his Juvenescence fund, he makes it easy for people to invest in the field as a whole. So they don't have to individually pick which companies they believe have the most probability of success. In reality, each individual company has only a small probability of success. But when there are enough companies working on the field together, an investment in Juvenescence can be spread out as a kind of basket across many other companies. And so there's a good probability that at least one or two of these companies will be successful from developing new therapies. So this is acquiring more and more investment. I forget the exact figures, but Juvenescence is receiving more funding the whole time. So there's two signs that it's encouraging. I've got others I can talk about as well.
One thing that you mentioned was all of these conferences. And in the book, you talk about that it's important to build a network for collaboration within the rejuvenation area. Has this changed since? Like, these conferences are one example of these networks being built?
Yes, absolutely. The network is going from strength to strength. And there's not just people talking to each other. It's people collaborating to create roadmaps for how successful various interventions are proving. So the lifespan.io site maintains a rejuvenation roadmap in which they look at, I think it's at least 50 treatments that are at various stages of investigation, some of which are reaching stages, I think, 3 and 4. Others are at earlier stages. So this information is all being gathered together. It's been classified into 9 categories according to the 9 categories of hallmarks of aging in a very famous scientific paper from, I think, 2013. So this information is there so that we all don't need to independently try and keep copies of it. It's there in a central repository and kept up to date. So the communities are going from strength to strength, and we are figuring out ways in which we can add our efforts on top of each other so that we have a synergy. We have 1 + 1 is more than 3, rather than unnecessarily fighting and competing and pulling in different directions. There's lots to be encouraged about.
David, there is an interesting point of your book in chapter 7 that you wrote, and I quote, "If I were to rewrite this chapter in, say, 5 years' time, much of its content could be significantly different, with new runners and riders taking the lead. I cannot anticipate now exactly who the new leaders will be in that race at that time, but I do anticipate that the race will have moved on substantially." So now, 4 years later, maybe you could update us about runners and riders.
Well, one approach that I didn't include in that chapter at that time is the approach that's been championed by Harvard writer David Sinclair. He has long been influential in the field of rejuvenation biotechnology. He has recently produced a book, I think it's called Lifespan. He addresses many of the same topics that I cover in The Abolition of Aging, but he writes from a very well-informed academic perspective. He's been running a large lab for many years at Harvard. And in his book, he talks a lot about an epigenetic approach to aging. So epigenetics is the fact that our genes are selectively turned on and off depending on material in the cover or the skin, if you like, of our DNA, whether there are methyl groups or ethyl groups there, which can either activate it or deactivate it. And according to this theory of aging, a lot of the ways in which our DNA is expressed changes over time because of mistakes in the epigenetic layering. So over time, the cells in different parts of our body, which all have the same DNA, more or less, they start to manifest characteristics which don't belong in that part of the body. So you might have a skin cell that starts generating some proteins which are only meant to be turned on in the heart, and vice versa. So this is an aging. Now, it's been known for a while that the application of something called the Yamanaka factors, they are investigated by a Nobel Prize winner from Japan, who discovered that by applying 4 factors, you could undo the epigenetic age of a cell. You could unwind it, if necessary, all the way back to being a pluripotent stem cell. We don't actually want to do that in the physical body, because that would mean the cells would forget what kind of cells they were. But what David Sinclair writes about in his book, and he explains it at some length, is a mechanism to partially undo the epigenetic aging. So the cells retain their characteristics. Heart cell remains a heart cell, a skin cell remains a skin cell, but they become a youthful heart cell and a youthful skin cell. And this is done by applying, it turns out, not all 4 of these Yamanaka factors, but 3 of them. And it should be done in a controlled way. We don't want it to go so far. So there's some very interesting research in the labs of David Sinclair. I think this is a very promising approach, which is likely to go further. Another field I didn't talk too much about in my book is an approach to one of the 7 fields that Aubrey de Grey writes about. It's senolytics, which undoes the damage of senescent cells. So in this theory, the significant contribution to aging is when individual cells go into a state when they are no longer able to repair themselves or to be wiped up by some repair mechanisms in the body. Sometimes our cells go wrong, and when we are young, that doesn't matter because the body is able to recover the content of these cells and generate new ones. But as we get older, this repair mechanism breaks down and our body gets full of senescent cells. Now, there's various substances called senolytics, which seem to be able to accelerate the recovery and reprocessing of these senescent cells. And there are a couple of companies, such as Unity Biotechnology, which has received funding from the world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, amongst others. And it's quite promising what's happening in that field of senolytics. So that's a second field that if I were to rewrite the book now, I would probably write in more length about.
And as you were talking about senolytics, and you mentioned Unity Biotechnology, this year, 2020, it will be published the results from a phase 2 clinical trial, one by Unity Biotechnology and one by the Mayo Clinic, regarding senolytics. And do you think that if these trials in humans show results that prove efficiency of senolytic drugs, do you think that this could change the global public opinion of the rejuvenation area?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, I believe most people have got these 2 desires which are both in our minds at the same time and pulling in different directions. There's one desire to hope that these treatments become available, and another desire that says, well, let's just make peace with aging and death. It's the so-called natural thing to do. It's the so-called mature thing to do. And these 2 desires are in tension with each other. But when there is more evidence available that these treatments can be applied, that they seem to work, that they don't have strange side effects, and that there is a path towards them becoming more cheaply available widely, then more people will have the confidence to say, yes, I would like this. People will have more confidence to say, yes, let's investigate it. And I should mention one more thing here. It's something else that's happened in terms of progress in the public mind. There have been quite a few political initiatives to deal with so-called healthy aging. There's one even in Britain. There is a group in Britain called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Longevity. The British Parliament has a number of these all-party parliamentary groups in which there are people from various political parties cooperating on a common cause in which they agree. Well, the one on longevity has said that we should extend health span, that people should be healthier for longer. And they've tended to focus on ways in which people who are getting older can nevertheless still have a good life. Even though they become more disabled, there should be techniques and technologies and social care that still gives them good care. So they will enjoy their longer years of life. But alongside that desire, which accommodates aging, A number of people in the group are saying, well, if we could all learn from super agers, the people who seem to be able to live to the age of 95 at least, and still be as healthy as the normal 65-year-olds, that would be good. So there is a minority voice in these groups that says, let's not just accommodate aging, let's extend healthy aging much further. And what will strengthen people who have that opinion is the evidence from trials that things can change more dramatically without adverse side effects. And in the end, I think there could be a tipping point in public opinion very fast, that within just a few years, many people who presently say they're not that interested in living much longer, beyond maybe 80 or 90, many more of them will say, well, if this is possible, let's hurry up. Let's ensure that these treatments are available to them and their loved ones as quickly as possible. And instead of it being a very much fringe or a minority interest with only maybe 1 or 2% of the population advocating for it, it could flip over and maybe we could have 20% and then 50% of the population saying, let's do it. And then government would respond. Then government would suddenly switch much more funding into this area, and we could have a very positive feedback cycle. That's well within our grasp.
Right.
Yes, that's why we asked about these human trials, because phase 2 is a phase in which the efficiency is measured. So it's efficiency in humans. So in fact, Aubrey de Grey's in the book Ending Aging says that after phase 2 clinical trials, maybe the medicines could be available. The regulation could change in order to make them available after phase 2. So that's why maybe this year, 2020, could be the year of this tipping point. And in that sense, you mentioned the UK and the parliamentary group. And talking about the Brexit question, we know that people have a lot of opinions about if Brexit is, in general, a good thing or a bad thing, but specifically for rejuvenation therapies. We know that the clinical trials in Europe are made by a European organization, and now that the UK is leaving the European Union, I would like to ask you if there is an opportunity for the UK to make things differently, make a different regulation, maybe to accelerate the rejuvenation therapies in some way. Now that the UK would be like independent from the European Union, what changes regarding the rejuvenation therapies?
So you ask a good question about what could accelerate the process of assessing the suitability of treatments. And one thing that can accelerate it is when it becomes more widely accepted that parts of aging can be treated as a disease. There's one argument that aging itself should be called a disease. There's a simpler argument, and one I support, which is that more aspects of aging can be identified and called a disease. We already treat some aspects of this as a disease. For example, there's something called sarcopenia, which means that our muscles become weaker. That's treated as a disease in its own right. There's a good initiative that's going to declare many more of these conditions as diseases. And once something is declared as a disease, it will allow faster targeting of these diseases by pharmaceutical companies. So that's one thing that can accelerate the process. Another thing is to have more freedom for people to take part in experiments as consenting adults and accepting the risks involved. There are elements of risk in all these treatments. Although I have said, I believe there will in due course be treatments without side effects. We don't yet know which treatments will have side effects and which won't. We also don't know which treatments are reliable from the point of view of actually being as they are stated. Sadly, there are many people who are offering treatments in stem cells, for example, that turn out to be having poor quality control standards. They're more interested in making money in some cases than in just helping people be healthy. So they may often cut corners. So I believe there is a need for monitoring of these providers of treatment. We need to protect people from being fooled or deceived by people who promise one thing but deliver another. At the same time, however, we must figure out how we can more quickly bring new treatments to more people. And let me mention here the COVID coronavirus, which is focusing people's minds. They're saying now this virus is likely to go everywhere. We're not likely to be able to control it. Therefore, we have to learn to coexist with it. Therefore, we need to hurry up and have a vaccine available. And people are now reflecting, why is it taking a long time to develop a vaccine? One aspect is that the financial incentives for the pharmaceutical companies don't particularly make a vaccine an attractive product for them. There are often side effects of vaccines. And by the way, you only apply them once, whereas the other drugs that they create have a long revenue stream associated. So the way the financial incentives are set up don't actually favor people doing a lot of research into vaccines. So people are saying, it's true, we need to change the incentive system to encourage people to put more effort into developing vaccines. The same change in mind will also encourage people to develop one-off treatments for rejuvenation biotechnology. So instead of selling people pills or other therapies on an ongoing long-term basis, they will instead try to develop treatments which only need to be given once, or maybe once every few years. Again, that needs different financial incentives. So more people are thinking about this now and thinking, how should governments change the economic landscape to encourage this kind of investment? So that's a good sign. Now, whether this is best handled by individual countries working in isolation, or whether it's best with countries cooperating with their insight, is an open question. Personally, I do still think it's better for companies to cooperate with their insights and learning, but at the same time, countries should be free to experiment locally with different regulatory regimes. So I think that is what's going to happen. There will be different countries that experiment in the short term with different approval mechanisms, and then they will look to see how well these new approval mechanisms are working in practice. Are they tending to accelerate cures, or are they instead tending to accelerate the availability of bad treatments that don't live up to their promises? And we're going to figure out together what are the right experiments to elevate and highlight and adopt. So that will happen in the wake of the coronavirus, and it will happen in the wake of the changes triggered by Brexit, as more countries look and try to figure out the right balance between agreeing on common standards, but also allowing individual experimentation. And probably the balance has been too much in Europe towards common standards without sufficient flexibility. And I now think in the wake of Brexit, that balance is going to switch back to more support for individual experimentation, which we can be happy about.
Great. So as you were talking, one of the things that could accelerate the development of the rejuvenation therapies is this regulatory aspect. If this changes, this could really accelerate. And recently, Albert de Grey said that the regulatory aspect is changing. Things are getting better. He mentioned that the new director of the FDA understands aging and a little better. Also, there's a trial for metmorphine that was authorized by the FDA. So do you agree with this, that this regulatory aspect is changing positively?
I do, and I agree with you also that the metformin trial, led by Nir Barzilai from Albert Einstein College in New York, is significant. It's treating aging as the end target for a trial in a clever way, and it is really encouraging that the FDA have supported it. What's even more encouraging is that it now seems that this trial is almost fully funded. It was for a long time awaiting funding to make it go ahead, but more people have come forward in the last 6 months or so to make up the shortfall. So I think this treatment, this trial rather, is called TAME, to address aging with metformin. I think it's going to change public minds. Whether or not this individual trial works, I think it will, by the way. I think it will work significantly. We'll also find out which people shouldn't take metformin to extend aging, but which people should. Whether or not it works, it's also going to encourage other people to take advantage of the new regulatory framework and trial other interventions in the same way.
David, now we have another subject in people's mind, that because in the book you say that people should enter in politics to help the rejuvenation area, to influence the state's organization in order to finance and to develop the rejuvenation area. And we have a situation in which the next president of the United States, who will assume in February of the next year, will be or 74 years old, or 78 years old, or 79 years old, because the three people who can win the presidential election in this year are people in that age. And two of them, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, if they are elected, they will probably try to be re-elected 4 years later with 82 years old and 83 years old. And maybe the age of the president of the United States could this age influence the debate, the public debate about the importance of extend people's life, the importance of health in old age? Because in your book, Abolition of Aging, there is an example from Emmanuel Ezekiel, who advocates that people with 75 years old shouldn't take a lot of care about their health. But now we have facts that the people who are going to assume the presidency of the United States are all of them practically at the age that Emmanuel Ezekiel told us that we don't need to take so much care of our health. So we have another example. Elizabeth Warren is like 70 years old. In the next election, she could be the Democratic candidate with 74 years old. So the reality is proving that we need to focus more on that. This reality about the age of these presidential candidates could influence in the rejuvenation movement.
It's remarkable, as you pointed out, the likely next president, whether he is Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, they're all well through their 70s. Interestingly, they are all older than Barack Obama. They are all older than the previous president, George W. Bush. They are all older even than the previous president, Bill Clinton. So it's remarkable that we're having such old people in this position. And I think it's going to help people realize that, you know, there is a group of super agers, people who can be very active well into their 80s, 90s, even in their hundreds. This group of people is increasingly being studied. They are exceptional in many ways, but there are enough of them that we can learn from them. They are people who reach the age of 95 who don't have cancer or diabetes or heart disease. They eventually do die, of course, but they tend to die very quickly, which means that there isn't much of a burden on the healthcare system. So more people are studying them. They are the focus of a book recently that came out, which again, I think is helping to change the public discussion. The book is called The Switch. It's by the researcher James Clement. and he highlights the evidence that a particular diet, as well as a particular genetics, might be significant in helping people to reach this stage. So we're going to have more discussion that, yes, many elderly people go downhill, but enough don't go downhill, and we have to find out what makes them different. Emmanuel Ezekiel, who I discussed at some length, his ideas in one of the chapters of my book, which you have kindly translated, he accepts that there are some people who do good research into their 90s, but he says, well, they are a minority and they are just there by chance. Well, I disagree. I don't think they're there just by chance. They're there because of factors which we can learn about and more people can benefit from, either by changing diet or by realizing what the new biological processes are in their bodies as a result of their diet, which we can then engineer in different ways. So I think that's one way in which the discussion is going to change. But another way in which the political discussion about aging is going to change, actually there's two more ways. One is Joe Biden famously had a son who died of cancer, and Barack Obama, when he was president and Joe Biden was vice president, gave Joe Biden a special responsibility to investigate what are new ideas in the treatment of cancer. Well, I personally think the best idea in the treatment of cancer is to address aging, and then we want to treat cancer as a side effect. So if Joe Biden is indeed the new president, it's possible he can go back to that line of inquiry and give it more prominence. I don't know. I haven't had that come up in the debate yet. But there's yet another way in which politics is paying more attention to aging. And the example there is from Germany. There is a party led by Felix Wirth. It's called the Party for, I forget the exact name. It's something like a research into scientific research into aging. All he's asking for is the single proposition that more of the budget should be put into addressing the causes of diseases of aging. And he works with a network of supporters there. And it's possible, if he stays on the current growth curve, that within a few years, he will start having some representatives in either the local government or even the national government. Because in Germany, they have proportional representation, which makes it easier for minority parties to break through. Now, I don't believe that Felix's party is going to form a government by itself, but it's changing the landscape of public discussion. More of the other parties will start to echo the same ideas. They will realize that there is public interest in this, and these other parties will then add the similar ideas to their own manifestos, in the way that the Green Party can influence politics around the world, not by necessarily being elected itself in any large quantities, but other parties adopt what they call part of a Green New Deal. Well, I think there's going to be a healthy longevity New Deal, part of a wider techno-progressive New Deal. Some small parties, such as Felix one in Germany. There was also a party led by Jose Cordero, Miel, in Spain, that emphasized similar ideas. And it's going to lead to other parties picking up the same phrase. So increasingly, we are going to hear about this from all political parties. And I don't think it's a matter of right or left. I think people from all parties can have a common interest in extending healthy longevity and indeed in abolishing aging.
Yes, well, just to tell everyone, the name of the party from Germany is the German Party for Health Research. We had it written down here. And we had a question to make to you about this party and Jose Cordeiro, his candidacy for the European Parliament. Also, there is Zoltan Esteban in the United States. And also, as you already talked about this, one other thing that, as you mentioned, that there's the Green Party that is basically in every country there is a Green Party. So do you think it's wouldn't it be important to have like a unified name for the rejuvenation movement? For example, recently there was a meeting in the University of Berkeley where they were discussing a name for this anti-aging rejuvenation movement. Do you think this is an important thing? And do you have any suggestion, like the rejuveneering movement?
So naming is very important. This is a lesson from marketing. If you give something the right name, it can make it easier for people to remember, easier for people to understand. I read a bit about that meeting. I even submitted some ideas to the organizers of that meeting in Berkeley beforehand. I haven't kept in touch with what their decisions are, but it's true that the right name will make a difference. And if we choose a name that appeals to just a minority of people, such as technology enthusiasts, we might have a counterproductive effect, because we might scare off or frighten off the mainstream. This is what I learned from my background in technology. There is a bell curve of adopters, and what appeals to the early adopters is often different from what appeals to the people in the mainstream. So emphasizing healthy lifespans or health spans, I think, is more appropriate than talking about immortality. Talking about immortality is exciting to all of us in a way, but it's unlikely to get a wide public endorsement for the foreseeable future. So something more intermediate is important. In terms of what that name is, it's still unclear, and I support the idea of having different groups trialing different messages, and then we should look and see what works in practice. So we have one approach in Spain, one approach in Germany. We also had an independent candidate standing in one of the constituencies in England for the EU elections, although now there's no British participation in the EU Parliament anymore. He did try to be elected there on a similar platform for healthy research. In America, we have Zoltan Istvan, and there is another transhumanist standing for another party. His name is Johann Ben Zion. He is the official candidate of the Transhumanist Party to be the president, and he is emphasizing healthy longevity. He came originally from another party. I think it was the Immortality Party, and we have to figure out what the right name is, and that will be important. For the time being, I talk about the abolition of aging. I think the abolitionist idea resonates in at least some parts of the world, because we can remember, for example, the abolition of slavery, that was initially viewed as a strange idea. People said slavery is part of nature. It's critical to human society. How could society operate without slaves? They even pointed to the Bible, when there's plenty of examples of the Bible apparently endorsing slavery as an accepted part of the social structure. The Bible says in the Old Testament, you shouldn't beat your slave so much that he dies. But if the slave misbehaves, then you can beat him and punish him so long as he doesn't die. That's your right, because he's your property, and so on. So people for a long time accepted slavery as a given, until more and more people said, we can do better. It's a moral outrage that there is such a thing as slavery. And it was many ordinary people. It was housewives. It was people up and down Britain and America who worked together for this great cause of the abolition of slavery. Aging is the same. People instinctively say, just as slavery that was thought to be a part of nature and a necessary part of society, people say, well, aging is a necessary part of nature. And again, more people are up and down the country in all walks of life are saying, no, we should be abolishing aging, which is why I like that particular phrase. But if others come up with a better phrase that has more chance of reaching to the mainstream and having a big impact, we should get behind it and use that as a common talking point.
David, there is a difference, an important difference between 2016 and 2020 regarding the private sector. In the 3 or 4 years since the publication of the abolition of aging, a lot of companies were created, biotechnology companies were created in order to pursue some components of the biotechnology therapies. So we had Oizin Biotechnologies, Underdog, Revel, which are some companies from the sense approach. But there are a lot of other companies Unity already existed, but not with the same size it has right now, and many other companies. So what do you think about this private sector activity? In which way it affects the outcome of all this research and the perspectives? Because was a relatively important difference from 2016.
You're completely right. This is a sector that is grown in leaps and bounds. The full list of companies working in this space is available on that rejuvenation roadmap from lifespan.io that I mentioned earlier, where it's being kept up to date, new companies coming into the field. So what's made this possible is a growing number of investors feel comfortable that the space is producing real results. It's not just speculation, it's not just theoretical science. There is more demonstrated in initial trials of various animals, and in some cases, trials in humans. There was the very important test of the rejuvenation of the thymus, in which people took part. It was reported on Nature that this 3 drugs that people took for a period of time seemed by some biomarkers to reduce people's effective age by noticeable amounts. So as there are more such results reported, even though it's still early days as regards making the treatment widely available, it's encouraging more people to have the confidence to invest. Second, as I mentioned earlier, there are the platforms that produce portfolios of these companies. So individual investors don't need to try and figure out which of these companies individually are more likely to succeed. They can spread their investments across a large number of these companies in parallel using new financial methods. It's the same financial methods, by the way, that were involved in the financial crash before 2007, 2008, 2009. So they got a bad reputation. But when they're used more skillfully and thoughtfully, they can actually be very significant. So some people even say financial innovation is the key to solving big diseases like cancer and aging. And we are learning more how to do that thanks to the work of people such as Jim Mellon and his associates. So it's coming forward. But I don't think that leaves the public sector off the hook. I think the public sector, that is funding from government, is still the best ways to do some fundamental research that maybe is going to take longer to turn into effective therapies. So the private sector is more patient than before, but still not patient enough. And that's where government investment into underlying longer term therapies is still very important. And that's what I expect to see change as more of the public become aware of this issue and raise attention to it and start asking their politicians to change some of the spending away from individual diseases into the common underlying causes of multiple aging diseases.
Great. Another thing that is related to this discussion is that in the book you talk a lot about the progress in artificial intelligence and deep learning and those things. You talk about IBM, Google, big data, and in 4 years those things tend to change a lot. And so what can you tell us about the progress in this area since 2016, and how are the computer sciences interacting with the rejuveneering area?
Well, one thing is that many of the large AI companies have developed groups that are focusing on applying their results in the field of health. Google has 2 groups. One is Calico, that's addressing aging directly. It has another group, I think it used to be called Verily. I'm not sure what its name is now. It may still be Verily. And they are looking more widely at applying techniques such as deep learning to help keep people healthy. I think the phrase is that Verily keeps people alive long enough so they can in due course benefit from whatever Google Calico produces. But there are some very encouraging developments. There was another report on Nature just about a month ago of the use of deep learning to produce new treatments for antibiotics, because many of the antibiotics are suffering that bacteria are increasingly resistant to the existing antibiotics. So what was done in this test is that a large number of compounds were analyzed by deep learning in terms of some of the chemical characteristics, some of their shapes, and in each case it was explained to the algorithm whether these chemicals were effective or not as antibacterials. And the system was asked to work out characteristics that might mean in other chemicals were suitable to be antibiotic as well. And then it was fed a large database of existing drugs that have been investigated for use in various diseases, which seem to be safe, but haven't yet proved sufficiently effective in different diseases. And the deep learning system was asked to look at this large set of drugs and try and identify those from this set which could also be antibacterial. But by the way, they should have different appearance, and they shouldn't be too similar to known existing antibacterial molecules. And it came up with a small number, and then people did more tests on it, and they have found one in particular. I think it's now been given the name halicin, which was initially tried for diabetes. It was found not to be effective for diabetes, but its information was still online. And it seems that this is a new and very powerful antibiotic which deals with a number of bacteria that previously looked like they were overcoming the treatments against them. So that's one sign of how deep learning can do things in a much larger scale than individual researchers could do. And I see this as being applied in identifying other treatments, which known drugs can be reapplied for. After all, many of the treatments that we've got often arose by accident. They were noticed initially as side effects for attempted treatments of other diseases, and then this new treatment became the subject of focus. And I believe this is happening with companies such as Alex Zavoronkov's in silico medicine. They are coming up with a whole bunch of interesting treatments. There's another Cambridge company called Helix, and they're applying deep learning too. They're initially targeting what they describe as rare diseases, so they don't affect enough people that it's worth going through long, expensive traditional routes to come up with treatments. So these traditional mechanisms don't have a good business case to deal with a small number of people with each rare disease. But Helix believe that their use of artificial intelligence is going to similarly find out quickly which existing drugs can be repurposed to cause the genetic changes to undo these rare diseases. So all the time there are more companies entering this space, applying existing methods of deep learning, and even pioneering new methods of deep learning in here. So I think we'll be experiencing more pleasant surprises in the months ahead as new drugs are found to be more effective than ever expected. Metformin's a similar example, of course. Metformin was initially developed for diabetes. It's a drug with a long pedigree. And it was noticed empirically by observation that people who had diabetes and who took metformin seemed strangely to live longer even than people who didn't have diabetes. So this was noticed by human observation. So that's one example of a drug being repurposed. Well, there are many other drugs and chemicals who can be investigated by artificial intelligence and then brought into the equation.
David, in your book, The Abolition of Aging, you mentioned some theories of aging, and I remember particularly like a difference between the telomeres theory and another theory which give to several kinds of damage more importance. I think you call it the telomere theory like a fundamentalist theory, and when there are several kinds of damages like pluralist theory. And this pluralist theory would be more like the sense approach by Albert de Grey. And In the book, you said something like, "Oh, well, we'll have to wait some years to see which theory is more adequate to the facts." And I would like to know nowadays in 2020 if there is some progress in order to we have clear picture or clearer picture of which theory is more adequate to reality. And regarding this, there are some developments recently about the telomere theory, because some companies by Bill Andrews or Liz Parrish, or there are some companies that are advancing in human treatment. Some companies are doing treatments in Colombia regarding telomerase therapy. So how do you see these tests, these trials in Colombia? Do you think they are safe? Do you think that they are a good thing? So there are two questions. One about the two theories, about the pluralist and the fundamentalist, and how it went in these 4 years, and regarding these experiments in Colombia, what do you think about it?
So as scientists, we should keep an open mind. We don't know the full story, so we should be willing to experiment and observe and reflect and learn. The question as to whether there is a single main cause of aging or there are multiple causes of aging remains open. The people who advocate focusing on telomeres believe that if telomeres were longer, many of the other aspects of aging would automatically be cured. Now, it may not cure all aspects of aging, but it may be that this is the biggest intervention. David Sinclair, who I mentioned earlier, he also realizes there's many aspects to aging, but he believes that if we could undo the epigenetic damage of aging, this might automatically undo many of the other types of aging as well. So he is pushing this singular view or fundamentalist view as well, not in the sense of being blind to the other possibilities, but in the view of saying, let's see how much is treated by this one intervention. So we still don't know. And I welcome the trials that are taking place by both Bill Andrews and by Liz Parrish. They have found a good way forwards. Liz Parrish's group, BioViva, they are addressing a number of diseases of aging, and they are now going to carry out these experiments to see if extending telomeres in selected parts of the body can reverse the appearance of these diseases of aging. And we should keep an open mind. There are conflicting theories. I think it probably will have an impact. Whether there's exactly how good an effect is something that science will teach us. In the meantime, we should continue to encourage multiple approaches. The senolytics approach, the approaches to deal with linkages between macromolecules, the approaches to have stem cell therapies, the epigenetic treatments of aging, and so forth. Let's pursue multiple ideas without being too ideological. I mean, ideology can have a big drawback if it blinds people to an open mind. What I particularly like about the conferences that Aubrey de Grey and Michael Graver organized, the Undoing Aging Conference, is that they welcome participation from many different points of view. And the scientists there discuss with admirable openness and objectivity and rationality. And when the evidence comes in favoring one point of view, I'm sure the majority of them will be able to revise their opinions and adjust their research programs accordingly.
Great. Another thing that we like to ask you is about the CRISP therapy, because there is a section in your book that is called the CRISP Game Changer. So that was the case in 2016. Is it still a game changer, or how has it progressed? Did it meet the expectations?
So there were a number of years in which CRISPR astonished scientists again and again by what it could accomplish. I think things have gone a bit more slowly recently. There was a bit of a setback due to an experiment in China by one researcher who used CRISPR to modify the DNA, the chromosomes of some babies, and it turned out that he didn't get the consent or the full informed consent of the parents of the babies, and he may have inadvertently reduced the lifespan of these children because of side effects from these treatments. So people, I think, are a little bit more cautious now about CRISPR. They are still exploring what may be done, but I think it's on the more, what we might say, sensible phase of its investigation. There are new developments still all the time in CRISPR. It seems that some CRISPR interventions could edit the epigenome rather than the genome. And so there's plenty more to be done here, but it hasn't gone quite as fast as some people had hoped. It turns out that genes have multiple effects, and when you change one gene, you may have side effects from them, which is why we may need to combine that treatment with many other treatments in parallel. And it also turns out it's quite an expensive thing to do. So we need to keep an open mind, keep exploring, and when something looks good, then we have to bring lots of resources to it to find ways to make it less expensive and more reliable.
David, about cryonics, the abolition of aging, you talked a lot about it, specifically in chapter 12, if I correctly remember. And cryonics is something that is not exactly for the future for a lot of people. So there are probably people who are thinking about it right now. And of course, it's an area which advances a lot, like the rejuvenation area a lot. So in these 4 years, first thing I would like to ask you, what advanced, what changed in the cryopreservation sector, if technologies improve it, if the number of people participating improve it. And another aspect I would like to ask you is that you mentioned in the book that some people can cryopreserve the whole body or cryopreserve only the head, for example, that it would be enough because then some decades later people could reconstruct the body. But I would like to ask you about this question, because for the psychological side, on the neurological side, there are some questions about if the personality depends only on the brain, because there is the possibility that the personality is formed not only by the brain, but it could have a corporal component as well. So if in Sigmund Freud studies, for example, the idea of self is linked to the whole body, not only the brain, the head. So my question is, maybe it wouldn't be safer in order to reconstruct the personality in the future to cryopreserve the whole body, then only the head, from a psychological and neurological point of view. So again, two questions. One, what changed in cryopreservation, and this question about the opposition between only cryopreserve the head or the whole body.
So there has been progress in the last 4 years in cryonics, but it's been slower than I had hoped. So earlier in this interview, I said that I believe we were on schedule for Plan A being achieved with 50% probability by 2040. The same prediction I made in my book, I stick to today, that we will have these rejuvenation therapies available with probability about 50% by that time. However, the hopes I had for improvements in the field of cryonics haven't gone quite so fast, and it's still in an early phase. There is some encouraging news about potential cooperation between different cryonics organizations, and there is a new group in Switzerland which is launching shortly with an event. and so they will announce themselves more fully to the world. They have the possibility to store cryopreserved bodies in Switzerland, and I think this is a useful addition to the overall field. Another piece of progress is that the number of scientists, including João Pedro de Magalhães, who's at the University of Liverpool. He's originally from Portugal. He has brought together a number of people online to look at alternative ways of cryopreserving organs. And the idea is that the same mechanisms that can usefully cryopreserve organs for longer can also be applied to cryopreserve either the brain or the whole body for humans. So it's discovering alternative antifreeze mechanisms that will prevent freezing and damage to the organs, but without poisoning them, because most antifreeze mechanisms are toxic. So that's an interesting piece of research that's going on. I'm not sure how fast that is going. I believe the field will go faster once there are more demonstrations of the successful bringing back out of animation of small animals. So we have the case of the C. elegans worm, research done by Natasha Vitamore and some collaborators, that they taught the C. elegans worm to associate a particular smell with food, and then they cryopreserved the creatures, putting them into deep storage for a while, in which all metabolic processes stopped. Then they brought them back carefully to state of life, and they remembered that this smell meant there was food. It was an unusual smell, by the way. It wasn't something that would be built into the evolutionary programming of their brains. So this showed that at least something was preserved. So that was encouraging. And when that happened, I thought there would be more experiments done. People have suggested perhaps the fly maggots would be the next phase. It's a bit more complicated. There are more cells in the brains, but that hasn't happened yet as far as I know. So that's still being held up. But I like to think that when this field gets more results to show, when we have more results also with cryopreserving individual organs for longer and bringing them back into successful use, it's going to encourage a change of opinion. In terms of whether we should cryopreserve the whole body or not, most people would say, given a choice and given the same cost, they would prefer to preserve the whole body. After all, there are neurons in the stomach as well as neurons in the brain. There are neurons throughout the body. Who knows to what extent these additional neurons contribute to personality? So to play safe, indeed, it would be wise to cryopreserve the whole body. However, that's more expensive. It's significantly more expensive. So many people convince themselves that all they need to do is preserve the brain. And probably that's where enough of the personality resides, and that the rest of the body can be brought back by reconstruction. So that's looking further ahead. The bigger challenge here is to make cryopreservation more affordable. Most people don't sign up for it because it's a lot of money, and they feel that their family would be expecting to inherit that money perhaps, and often there are arguments in the family members of people who are cryopreserved. They try to insist that the people didn't really mean it, that they were under psychological distress or mental weakness when they signed over the money to cryonics. If that money was less, then more people would do it, and it would be something that will grow in popularity. So how are we going to bring down the cost? In part, it requires more scale. When there are more people involved, it's the same with all technologies. The price can come down. But so long as it remains a minority interest, sadly, the price will remain high. So we're still at the early stage of that transformation. Hopefully, if you were to ask me again in 5 years or 4 years, I could point to more progress with chronics becoming more demonstrated. Not that we'll bring back humans yet, but we might bring back some much smaller animals. And when that happens, people will say it's not a pipe dream, it's something that might happen. And at the same time, we have to drive down the costs and make it more widely affordable so that more people will get involved.
Great. So we had a lot of questions prepared for you. I think we covered basically all of them. So we want to ask you, is there anything else that you want to comment about what changed since the book was published in 2016, or anything else you want to talk about?
I think we've covered the most important things. We've talked about new communities with more events. We've talked about progress with trials. We've talked about the fact that the actual reversal of aging by some characteristics has been published in leading scientific magazines such as Nature. We've talked about growing commercial interest and even political interest. And I believe we're going to see more people accepting the goodness of the argument for the longevity dividend, which means that if we invest in this area, we will actually see economic benefits as well as humanitarian benefits. So it requires multiple approaches, and I'm encouraged by what's happening. We need more people to read about it, more people to realize that it's not just a far-off pipe dream. It's something that could happen within a few decades if more people get involved. We need more people to have the confidence to start researching this area by themselves. They can even do it part-time and be useful in helping to develop alternative ideas, helping to develop software to test new theories, helping to develop new deep learning models which could investigate treatments more quickly, helping to win the public argument over, finding clever new ways to help to give people more confidence that this is a good thing to wish for, rather than sticking with what they perceive nature has given us, which is aging and death. We should have more people confident to say aging and death are wrong. It's not something we can tolerate. We should be campaigning as fast as possible for the abolition of aging here and now.
David, talk about your projects. What are you working on right now? What are your future projects? Please tell our audience what you plan for the next years or next month.
So I've written another couple of books since then. I've written this book, The Sustainable Superabundance, which tries to set out in more detail the vision of what the world will be like when we use technology to have much longer health spans, as well as much greater intelligence and a much greater access to renewable energy and healthy food. So I've spelt that out, explaining what needs to be done in terms of an improved cooperation and collaboration. This is a much thinner book, by the way. And then more recently, I've written another book. It's called RAFT 2035. RAFT stands for Roadmap to Abundance, Flourishing, and Transcendence. I've tried to set out a series of specific goals which political leaders and other leaders should set for Britain, although similar goals can apply for other countries too, in terms of what we should be focusing on. And it talks in terms of embracing automation so that people no longer need to work for a living, that they can have a good quality of life based on what automation and AI robots are doing for us, amongst a bunch of other goals. And in each chapter in here, it sets out 15 goals for 2035. I set out some intermediate milestones to achieve within just 5 years by 2025. And it won't surprise you to know that goal 1 in this is tied up to the subject of the abolition of aging. I've said it's a good goal to set that by 2035, the average health span in Britain will have been raised as high as 90. That's as a step towards the abolition of aging. Goal 2 focuses on better mental health for everybody. And goal 3 talks about automation, and so on, all the way through to goal 15, which is about using AI to have a much better political discussion rather than politics of today, in which we humans often make a mess out of politics. We can draw upon a house of AI that will help us to have better discussions and reach better conclusions. Not that the AIs will be in charge, but they will be excellent guides and servants and assistants to our discussions. So that's what I've been working on. I'm trying to get more people to sign up for a vision of a much better future, rather than being afraid of the way that technology is taking things.
Great. And how can people find out more about you? Where can they go online to know what you are doing?
So there are several things that I do. There's londonfuturist.com, which highlights the meetings of London Futurists, which we tend to film so people elsewhere in the world can see them, even if they can't come to London. There's my own consultancy, deltawisdom.com. It has a page about the books, all 9 of the books I've been involved with, either as author or as lead editor. It also talks about the various lectures and seminars and workshops that I can run to help people think about the possibilities of the future. And you can find me on Twitter as well. My Twitter name is quite short. It's DW2, where I post all kinds of ideas from multiple sources about future possibilities, how we can ensure we have a world in the future of sustainable superabundance rather than a new dark age.
So I'd like to thank David Wood for his time, for talking to us, and thank you everyone who is watching. And well, let's keep going. We need to change things and to get this movement going.
Okay, bye-bye everybody, and let's keep it up.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to a really wonderful future together.
Okay.